Tweet at Today SOR.
With our eye on the centenary of 1916 next year, it's a good time to look at the state of Ireland before the Rising. And if we look at those decades, one of the key ideas to emerge was that the Irish had lost the ability to be cultural innovators and instead had become slavish imitators of all things British, the West Britain syndrome diagnosed by Douglas Hyde. In many ways, the Irish Cultural Revival was an attempt to address this and to promote new modes of thinking in this country. These are some of the themes explored in the Handbook of the Irish Revival, recently published by the Abbey Theatre Press, and in the months leading up to the centenary, we'll be talking to its authors Declan Kiberd and PJ Matthews about the changing political temperature in Ireland leading up to 1916. Today in studio, PJ Matthews from the UCD School of English is joined by actors Barry Barnes and Cathy Belton to look at Ireland in the early phases of that literary revival. PJ, the last time you were here, we were talking about the sense of crisis that persisted after the death of Parnell and when the country seemed to be gripped by a state of paralysis. How did the major thinkers and writers of the Irish Revival break that deadlock?
Many of the key figures of the period were deeply connected, I suppose, with many of the international ideas they'd soaked up in London, in Paris, and there was obviously connections with the United States in terms of the Irish diaspora there. But the other interesting thing was a renewed sense of connection with Irish culture. The Irish language and its cultural inheritance was really important. And I think there's interesting comparisons to be made with the Italian Renaissance, for example. That when we think of that moment, it's one about the rediscovery of the ancient texts of Greece and Rome. At this time, people are rediscovering the power and the richness of Gaelic texts, and I think that really has a hugely important role in re-energising the whole cultural scenario.
But at the same time, though, isn't it interesting that many of the central figures leading this Irish Renaissance had come from an Anglo-Irish Protestant background?
When you think about it, many of these figures coming to the fore, many of them have a kind of conversion moment, and we can see that even in the accounts that they give us of how they become interested in this material. It's almost as if they have a born-again kind of experience. And a good example of that is Standish O'Grady, who writes a very interesting essay called A Wet Day, where he talks about being in a house in the west of Ireland and being shocked to discover the richness of Irish history, because in his own education in Trinity College and in all his formal education, he heard nothing about Irish history or Irish myth and legend.
OK, let's just hear a passage from that essay.
I think I was in my 24th year when something happened which has since then governed the general trend of my life. In a country house in the west of Ireland, near the sea, I had to stay indoors one rainy day, and though my appetite for literature was slender enough then, in default of other amusements, I spent the time in looking over the books in the library. So I chanced upon O'Halloran's History of Ireland in 3 volumes, the first history of Ireland into which I had ever looked. I was greatly interested, perhaps excited. How, I thought, was all this interesting history of my own country never brought before my notice by anyone?
So it would seem O'Grady, who knew practically nothing about ancient Ireland, is immediately enthused by it, and he would go on to become one of the experts on this topic.
Yeah, you can tell from this account that there's a real shock here that he's discovering something that he knew nothing about before. It's almost like the serendipity of a random moment, and out of that moment comes so much, because in fact he would go on to become one of the great scholars of the Irish literary revival period, and he had a huge influence on lots of the writers who came after him, including people like W.B. Yeats. His key idea was that figures like Cuchulainn could become models of I suppose, self-reliance. And of course, he's coming from a unionist perspective at this point, but a couple of decades later, a man called Pearse would use the figure of Cuchulainn for very different purposes in St. Enda's School and in the run-up, of course, to events in the GPO in 1916.
Indeed. Let's hear a bit more from O'Grady himself.
Of course, like everyone else who has ever dipped into this antique Irish literature, I could not fail to be deeply affected by the great story of Cuchulainn's heroic defence of Ulster against the banded host of the rest of Ireland. This story kept simmering in my imagination and finally eventuated in my writing History of Ireland, Heroic Period, Volumes 1 and 2. Though the professors and educated classes in general laughed at or ignored me, a good many young men and young women quite unknown to me did not, such as Miss Tynan, Miss Eleanor Hull, Mr. Yeats, Mr. Rolleston and others. These young people growing up and going to London were good enough to talk about my book. So London publishers wrote to me and asked me to send them something for publication.
You mentioned there, PJ, that O'Grady's influence on a whole emerging generation of young writers was evident at this time. We've heard a lot, obviously, about Yeats in this year of commemoration of his birth. But who else might we be thinking about in this context?
Well, I think a good example here is a figure like Alice Milligan, who was herself from County Tyrone, from Omagh, County Tyrone. She was from a Methodist background. She was a key mover, really, in the revivalist milieu. She was somebody who was interested in theatre. She was also the editor of a radical newspaper called the Shan Van Vucht, which in fact published some of James Connolly's early essays on politics. She was somebody who set herself against her own class and very much influenced, I think, by figures like Parnell. But there's a very interesting poem by Alice Milligan called When I Was a Little Girl, which is really all about her being a rebel or a dissident or somebody who was sort of disconnecting somewhat from her own cultural background or inheritance. And this poem describes her as a little girl playing in a garden and one evening being called in by her nanny. And the nanny is scaring the kids by talking about the bogeymen coming. But in this case, the bogeymen coming are the Fenians.
Come in, for it's growing late and the grass will wet ye. Come in, or when it's dark, the Fenians will get ye. Then at this dreadful news, all helter-skelter, the panic-struck little flock ran home for shelter. And round the nursery fire sat still to listen. 50 bare toes on the hearth, 10 eyes a-glisten. To hear of a night in March and loyal folk waiting to see a great army of men come devastating. An army of papists grim with a green flag o'er them, red coats and black police flying before them. Then the wind-shaken pane sounded like drumming. Oh, they cried, tuck us in, the Fenians are coming! 4 little pairs of hands in the cots where she led those over their frightened heads pulled up the bedclothes. But one little rebel there, watching all with laughter, thought, when the Fenians come, I'll rise and go after.
Radical stuff there indeed, PJ. But Alice Milligan, she wasn't the only woman at the time who was eager to take part in the action, was she?
No, she was really just one of a whole plethora of radical women to emerge at this time. And what's interesting is that they're asking interesting questions about the place of women in society, the idea that women should be confined exclusively in the house, and really looking for a public role, a public place for women at this time. A good example here, of course, is Constance Gore Booth, or probably better known as Countess Markievicz. She grew up in Lissadell in County Sligo, the daughter of the big house, so to speak. But again, we can see ways in which she begins to kind of distance herself from that that kind of cultural inheritance. We know her, probably most nowadays, as somebody who took part in the 1916 Rising with Connolly in the Irish Citizens' Army. But there's much more to her. There are many more strings to her bow. She was involved in lots of interesting movements and societies in theatre, in experimental art. She delivered a very important lecture in 1909 on women, ideals and the nation. And what's really worth listening out for here is how really she's aligning the struggle for women with the cause of the Irish nation, and the central idea being here, of course, that women are equal citizens.
A Renaissance woman, certainly indeed, Constance Markievicz. But let's hear now some ideas from that essay, Women, Ideals and the Nation.
The old idea that a woman can only serve her nation through her home is gone. So now is the time. On you the responsibility rests. No one can help you but yourselves alone. You must make the world look upon you as citizens first, as women after. For each one of you there is a niche waiting. Your place is the nation. Try and find it. It may be as a leader, it may be as a humble follower. Perhaps in a political party, perhaps in a party of your own. But it is there, and if you cannot find it for yourself, no one can find it for you. If you are fitted for public work, take up any that is within your reach, so long as you can feel that you can do it. Ireland wants reforming, sweeping clean from ocean to ocean, and it is only the young people can do it.
So this idea of reforming, of sweeping clean, to quote from that essay, a fresh start for Ireland, PJ, it seems to emerge over and over again in the writing and speeches of the period. Would it be fair to say, though, that many of the leading figures were keen then to change the actual conditions of Irish life during this period?
Well, I think that's a fair point. People often think about the Irish revival and revivalists in general as a bunch of almost hippie dreamers who are kind of removed from the real world and reality in some respects. But actually, if you look closely at the work of some of the central figures, you'll see that they were as keen, I think, to change Ireland as it actually existed as they were to produce, works of the imagination and art and poetry and so forth. And a very good example here is George Russell, A.E., who Joyce disparagingly referred to as the hairy fairy because he had a very prominent beard. But he was somebody who cycled all over Ireland trying to get farmers to cooperate and to get involved in agricultural cooperation. But he was also somebody who was interested in painting and in poetry as well. So he's a very good example. And he had an astute kind of sense that, look, the Anglo-Irish class are on the wane, their influence is fading away, and we need to replace intellectual life in Ireland, cultural life in Ireland with something else. And he was very keen to kind of promote that idea. And
the or the hairy fairy, to use that Joycean description, he was somebody who was a vocal advocate, was he not, for village libraries all over the country. Now let's hear some of the thoughts from his essay, Village Libraries. It was published in 1906.
There are no bookshops in Ireland outside Dublin, Belfast, Cork, Derry, Limerick and perhaps one or two other towns. In other countries, the peasant has his library. We in Ireland must try not to lose all interest in the higher thought or culture of the world. In the democracy of the future, every man must be his own duke.
So I think we could see from an extract like that, the revival at this time is really a kind of an energetic time, and there's a lot of investment in this idea of a thought revival when new ideas and initiatives are being presented and tried out and debated.
Yeah, but PJ, was it all high seriousness at this time, or do we have any sense of excitement of living through what were clearly heady times? In other words, I suppose in a simple question, was there any crack to be had?
Well, I think there was a lot of crack to be had. I mean, when we read back over the period, and particularly some of the accounts of people who were involved in it, giving their own memoirs and their own sense of the period. Now, we must be careful here because people are not all singing from the same hymn sheet. There are different notions of what the Irish revival is, and there are serious debates and controversies and people at each other's throats and so forth. But really, the main idea that is emerging is that there is a belief now that Ireland can be a centre of possibility and a centre of creativity in ways that weren't apparent in the earlier 19th century.
And I suppose Mary Collum is somebody you would point to as maybe giving good expression to that.
Yes, she was very much a revivalist figure who was caught up in many of these ideas and in many of these movements. She knew James Joyce. She was educated at UCD. She knocked around with people like Thomas MacDonagh. And she gives us one of the most interesting accounts of this period in her memoir, Life in the Dream.
Dublin was a small city. The suburbs stretched out to a distance, but the centre, the old part of the city, was circumscribed and bristled with movements of various kinds. Dramatic, artistic, educational. There were movements for the restoration of the Irish language, for reviving native arts and crafts, for preserving ancient runes, for resurrecting native costume, an array of political movements. Here too were the theatres, the tea rooms and pubs which corresponded to the cafe life of the continental city. In the centre too were the headquarters of the clubs and societies, some at war with each other, but all exciting and somehow focused towards one end, a renaissance. Between Abbey Street and College Green, a 5 minutes walk, one could meet every person of importance in the life of the city at a certain time in the afternoon.
Perhaps it's still the case. Beautifully read. Thank you indeed. That's Cathy Belton and Barry Barnes. PJ, you're going to be back next month. We're going to look more closely at some of the movements and manifestos that appeared at the height of the revival. Thank you all for coming in. And you can get more details from those wonderful speeches and articles in the Handbook of the Irish Revival. It's edited by Declan Kyberd and PJ Matthews. We'll have more, as I say, on this next month.
Today with Sean O'Rourke on RTÉ Radio 1.